Our blessing, Baruch Atah Adonai Eloheinu Melech Ha'olam Asher Bachar Banu Mikol Ha'amim V'nasan Lanu Es Toraso Baruch Atah Adonai Nosein HaTorah Shema Shema Yisrael Adonai Eloheinu Adonai Echad. Okay. So we last week were discussing and explaining the political situation that was going on. Just one second, another little commercial here. Okay, let's try to. Sorry. Everything has challenges. Of course, there's advantages because people can attend who be a little harder to drive, but then of course there's disadvantages because life continues. So we were saying that last week we were explaining that the political situation was tremendously impacting what was happening in Jewish life in Israel. And we understood that almost for the entire period of the Second Temple era, the Jews were under some other governing force. They started off, even when they had permission, they were given permission by the Babylonian Empire that had sort of morphed into this Persian Median Empire to go back. And then Ahasuerus rescinded the permission, and then his son Darius again gave the permission. So that meant the whole time they're under this Persian Median Empire, which we said began crumbling, and the Greeks, starting with Alexander the Great, took over. And we discussed last week the concept of Alexander the Great and how he really wanted to promote the Greek culture. He believed in the Greek culture. He was not only wanted to be a world conqueror, he wanted to, as he conquered the world, to gift the world or coerce the world to accept the Greek culture, the Greek pantheon of gods, the Greek sports, the Greek stadiums, the Greek amphitheaters. All of this was very, 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 very important to him, and we explained the tremendous miracle that occurred, that Alexander the Great did not coerce this on the Jews with Simon the Tzaddik, Shimon HaTzaddik, and what happened then. But Alexander the Great, like all of these world conquerors, did not last too long. He died relatively young after a relatively short reign, and at that point his very, very precarious kingdom got split up among his various generals, and there was a lot of infighting between them, and we were just sort of like the sacrifice of whoever was the ruling force that grabbed this area, with us included. It wasn't like we took part and chose a side or went for this general or pledged allegiance. We were more like, we're living in this country and they're grabbing for power, and sometimes this one gets control and sometimes this one gets control. What was the Jews more focused on, and the Jewish leaders focused on, was the infrastructure of Jewish life, knowing these were such precarious times, knowing we have all these waves of conquest flooding the world at this time. In the world, it was a very precarious time. We need to make the inside strong because the outside was very, very not strong. So who were the leaders? Well, the leaders became a pair. Originally, in the time of Shimon HaTzadik, Simon the Tzaddik, he was of such a caliber that he literally did it all. He was the ultimate spiritual leader, and he was at the same time the de facto political leader. But that was a very unique ability, and his successors didn't have it. Which again, we're not flawing them. We're not saying, you know, they were weak and they were bad. No, they're all great people. It's just very unusual for God to expect someone to be both the political and the spiritual leader of the people. Maybe that was Moses's role, but he did have Aaron, his sidekick high priest, who also was very instrumental in bringing the Jews to a certain spiritual enormous height. Obviously, Moses did as well. But he did have a partner. So at this point, the sages instituted what they call in Hebrew zugot, which means pairs. And this was a system. This system lasted for 5 generations. So for 5 generations, we have, it's not random, it's selected. The 2 greatest sages, but great in different ways, that are the spiritual forces that are both politically and spiritually ruling the Jewish people. They were given the power, or the appointment was through the Sanhedrin. And we already discussed the Sanhedrin as an ultimate tribunal rabbinical court of 70 plus, which became 71. At this point, we're going to give it to 72 elders. And this court, which was a spiritual court, it was educating God's rules and determining what is the correct response of the correct details of the commandment, also became the energy, the power base of the Jews' political voice. So from the Sanhedrin became appointed the 2 greatest people. One was called the Nasi. The Nasi, in this case, we might view as like the president of the Sanhedrin. The Nasi represented the Sanhedrin, which means ultimately represented the Jews in political affairs. So the Nasi was the one that was representative to whoever was the ruling power at that time, the one that dealt with that power, that tried to mitigate the laws, that tried to make it more tenable, lessen the taxes, lessen the pressures. That was the Nasi. He was the political leader, but again, the political Torah leader. His authority came from Torah. He was appointed by the Sanhedrin. He was from the greatest of the Sanhedrin. So he's a political leader, but through his power of Torah, that's why he's ascending to this position. There was another leader of the Sanhedrin called the Av Beit Din. And the Av Beit Din means the spiritual head of the Sanhedrin, the ultimate, educating force on this entire body. So this is when we have the Sanhedrin morphing from 71 to 72 people, because we have the 70-man body of the Sanhedrin, and we have the 2 leaders, the head of the political and the head of the spiritual. I'm sorry. Growing and growing and growing. Obviously, the explosion of this, which we all know more or less, is the story of Chanuka. But the story of Chanuka didn't happen in a vacuum. It came after many years of the Hellenists pushing more and more and more their culture, their idolatrous culture, their worship of the human body culture, their worship of the human mind culture on the Jewish people. So we said this began with Alexander the Great, who was already ready to okay, take my idols, take my amphitheaters, take my sports, take my beautiful buildings. And with Simon the Tzaddik, with Shimon Tzaddik's miraculous intervention, Alexander the Great was pacified. Which we said he instead of the idols, all the boys of the priests for a year were named Alexander, and the sages instituted a dating system from Alexander's rule that actually lasted for about 1,000 years. The next big demarcation line in the Hellenist attempt to take over and to, in a sense, poison, to pull out what their version is of the good, but a Hellenist version of the good, was with the Septuagint, which was in the year 3515. Now, at this point, as I said, the Jews were under just whoever was the the person that had the power that took over this whole area, which happened to be including this Israel, was the Ptolemaic kings. These were Egyptian kings, all from Ptolemy, one of the generals of Alexander. And there was a certain one of the Ptolemaic kings. He was called Ptolemy II, and he was called Philadelphus. Philo in Greek means a lover of. Philadelphus, a lover of books. We have in America Philadelphia, right? Which means a city of brotherly love. Philadelphus, a lover of books, because he was a lover of books in a Greek way, a lover of wisdom in a Greek way, and he collected an entire library, which to us nowadays is, hey, we got one in Chicago also, and one in Skokie, and go to downtown for an amazing library. But in those days, this was an unheard of accomplishment, especially for a pagan, Gentile. That wasn't where their emphasis usually went. His emphasis was in books. So what do we care? What does it have to do with Jewish history? Because he heard about the great wisdom in the Jewish Torah. And he said, oh, I want to add that to my library. But obviously, the Jewish Torah is written in Hebrew, and he can't read Hebrew. And he wanted an authentic version. And he was the king, and in those days, kings have absolute power. So he ordered 72 sages to come from Israel to Alexandria. He put each one in a separate room, and he gave each one the job of translating the Torah into Greek. Now, why did he do it this way? Well, we can understand. He wanted the authentic version of the story. If he has one person translating it, or maybe a cohort of 3, they're going to do a correct job or a not correct job. If he's going to take the 72 top sages, he knows he's going to get the real version. But if they're all together, still, maybe they're going to, if I have 72 people in 72 different locked rooms, if what comes forth, whatever comes forth as the majority voice, that's the real deal. That was his thinking. You could see how truly he wanted this real, exact, precise translation. Well, it sounds like a simple enough task for the sages, but it actually wasn't. Why wasn't it? Because there were a number of verses that they knew they could not, each sage in his own room, locked up. And he had no way to communicate, no text, WhatsApp, email, no Morse code, no way of communicating with any of the other 71 sages. But he knew that he could not translate this literally. Because he translated it literally, it would be a great opening for the Greeks to say, oh, look, this is what Judaism says. There are many, many examples. I think there were 10 verses that they translated not precisely. Like, for example, it says, and they saw, one of the verses describing right before the giving of the Torah says, and they saw the God of the Jewish people, the God of Israel. Every one of these 72 sages sitting in isolation, locked up, translated that verse as, and they saw the glory of the God of Israel. Not trying to misconstrue the verse, but not trying to give a literal interpretation that would be a point of misconstruing Judaism. And there were many other such. I believe there were 10 such times. So the miracle that happened here was we have 72 sages in 72 locked rooms, and every one of them translated exactly the same, including these, I believe, 10 times when they did not translate it literally. Each one of them had those same 10 specific ones, and each one of them translated those 10 specific situations exactly the same way. So this is a miraculous event. What a celebration. The sages did not celebrate. Some people did celebrate. The Jews of Alexandria celebrated. At this point, the Jews that were living in Alexandria were primarily assimilated Jews. As assimilated meaning the Hellenist culture more and more got to them. And those were the types of Jews that left Israel and moved to Alexandria to be part of the hub of where it's happening. You know, the Manhattan of that day was Alexandria in Egypt. So let's be part of the hub. Let's be part of the culture. Let's be part of where things are moving and shaking. So these Jews rejoiced. Whoa, our Torah is so cool. It's so brilliant. The Greeks love brilliant philosophy, wisdom. Now we're going to go up a few notches in the Greeks' eyes because they're going to see how cool our wisdom is. That was the perspective of the assimilated Jews of Alexandria. The perspective of the sages including these 72 elders that were forced to translate it and experience God's revealed miracles in translating it, they mourned it. They said it was a horrible day. Why was it a horrible day? Like, it's a good thing to translate. I mean, nowadays, Art Scroll translates, you know, we got the Torah in English, we have it in French, we have it in Russian, we have it in Spanish. We're all into translating. So why did the sages view it as a horrible thing? Because it wasn't being translated by the sages for the Jews that don't understand Hebrew. It was being translated by Talmai. In Hebrew, we say Talmai. In English, it's Ptolemy. By the Ptolemaic leader, Talmai. It was his Torah that he wanted. He wanted to be under him, which means he was taking this Torah, and instead of viewing it as God's Torah, he was viewing it as another interesting book on his bookshelf, another wisdom for him to think about and to pull into the Greek way, like another support for more Greek philosophy. And as we've seen since then, you know, the Christians have taken this also and used it to falsify the scriptures for their means. So this was considered an ultimate tragedy. Again, on a level to understand it, it's like taking the deepest, purest oil, the oil of God's essence, wisdom, and then giving it to someone with like dirty fingers to anoint himself with, like some dirty, coarse-handed person. We're taking God's wisdom, and Talmai is saying, I want to dabble in this. I want to see how I could use this. I want to see how this is going to enhance some different Greek philosophy by bringing in some Torah concepts that I'm going to find aligned with the Greek, which in general is you know, any true wisdom in the world we view as having at its core a piece of Torah. So sometimes you can, you know, on all levels, you could read a book about marriage, the empowered wife, and see some thoughts that sound like Torah in it. You can read the, I forget what they call it, the something, the gift, I don't remember what it is, and see, oh wow, trust creates reality. They say it too. You can learn political isms and look at like a communism and say, oh, Marx just was someone that really wanted Mashiach. You know, you can find sprinklings, dashes of the wisdom of Torah in everything, because that's the only real wisdom there is. So any wisdom that's going to be is going to have at its core this spark of a thought, of a concept, an energy from Torah. But that doesn't validate the rest of the wisdom. The rest of it could be, you know, whatever the garbage is in a person's brain, spinning and spinning and spinning around this one piece of truth. And when you look at it, you see the truth. So you say, oh, it's true. Wait, no, all the rest of it is garbage. So when Talmai took the Torah and he wanted to translate it for his enhancement, for his aggrandizement, for his being able to conjure up more Greek philosophy, feeding off the wisdom of Torah, the sages said, this is a tragedy. This is horrible. This is the defiling the oil, meaning, of course, we have later with Chanuka, how the oils of the temple were defiled. The oil started being defiled here in 3515 is when the oil was defiled, because the oil of God's wisdom was defiled by Talmai. And this set the stage for in 3586. So we're talking about 70 some years later is when Antiochus rose to power, and he physically defiled the oils of the temple. But this is when the oil started being defiled, meaning from our perspective, there's nothing more precious than the purity of God's Torah. And we don't want to take a dash of it and then blend it with a few other nice ideas and create a new cholent, you know, a new dish that has a little Torah mixed in with a bunch of other things. It's not fair to Torah. Don't do that to Torah. And that's what Talmai was doing. And this was a day the sages said was a tremendous, tremendous tragedy. So this was a tremendous demarcation line in the Hellenist invasion of the Jewish people. Because here they invaded our heart, they invaded our soul, they invaded our Torah. Here they took our Torah and translated it to Greek. They forced us to translate it to Greek, which means now they're putting their fingers on the Torah. And now if we would say something from Torah, they're like, oh, we know that too. We can also quote it in a very distorted way. So that's why this was a tremendous demarcation line in the Hellenists trying to take over the minds and the hearts of the Jewish people. Unfortunately, the Hellenists were quite successful. This was a tremendous time of assimilation for the Jewish people, which assimilation was pretty unprecedented. The first time we actually saw assimilation was when the Jews were in exile in Babylonia, and the Jews started assimilating and becoming like the Babylonians. Until then, they were in Israel. They might have been sinning, they might have been worshiping idols, but they weren't assimilated. They were Jews. They weren't going in the ways of the Gentiles. They didn't view themselves like the Gentiles. They weren't looking to be like the Gentiles. Why would they want to be like the Gentiles? The Gentiles are far inferior to them on every level. But now suddenly we have these Greeks who seemingly claim to be superior. We have culture. Oh, we have Jewish culture. Oh, your culture is so backwards. We got the real thing. We have science. We have wisdom. We have philosophy. Oh, we have Torah. Yeah, we know your Torah. We have it too. Oh, we have sports. Oh, we don't really have sports. We have theater. Oh, we don't really have theater. We have cool clothing. Oh, we're backdated. We have cool names. They really started taking the Jews and making them like, we want to be like the Greeks. In other words, this was an onslaught of culture that the Greeks were spreading everywhere they went. And most of the places they went to, the people were very receptive, because what did the pagans have? They had nothing to compare to what the Greeks were offering. So they took it and thought it was great. But the Jews were resistant, because the Jews said, well, no, we have our tradition. Our tradition is far superior. The Greeks said, really? You're superior to us? No way. We're going to get you. So they put tremendous pressure and financial resources to like building up amphitheaters, gymnasiums, to try to take all of this, which of course the Greek culture is the foundation of the Western world. So all the things that the Greeks admired, like the human body, the human mind, health, theater. I mean, we have that all in our culture today. It all came from the Greeks. So all of this they were pushing on the Jews. And a lot of the Jews thought it was really cool. And they started wearing the Greek togas. They started calling themselves Jason and other Greek names. Some of them tried to surgically change and cover over their circumcision so it shouldn't look like they're circumcised, because to the Greeks, a circumcision was a horrible thing. You're defiling the beauty and perfection of the human body. You know, in the Greek sports, the people performing are all performing naked, like flaunting the human body. So this is like, let's display the human body, the perfection of the human body. And of course, at the end of the sports, it all became an idolatrous sacrificing to their gods. So let's warp your Jewish minds that the main thing is the body, the main thing is working out, the main thing is being physically fit. And then we're going to throw and sprinkle it all in with some idolatry as well. So this is what was going on. And there was a lot of pressure, and a lot of Jews succumbed. A lot of Jews succumbed. The minority of the Jews stayed faithful to God and said, no, this is fine for the Gentiles, but for us, our idol isn't the human body. Our idol isn't sports. Our idol isn't theater. Our idol isn't coliseums. Our idol isn't worshiping these deities. Our idol isn't the human mind. We're Jews. We value intellect, but we don't worship the human mind. We worship God. We worship God. We're not worshiping anything but God. That was a minority voice. Again, it didn't happen overnight, because I'm trying to date this. You should understand the movement of history. The Septuagint happened in 3515, and Antiochus came into power in 3586. We're saying that some 71 years later. So over these 71 years, more and more and more, the Hellenist culture was making inroads in the Jewish people's life. And we said, the more assimilated it became, well, then you moved to Alexandria. You want to be in the hub. But if you weren't as with it, and you stayed in Israel, you still want to be just like the Greeks. In other words, history repeats itself. That's a wonderful thing about learning history, is to understand history, to understand what we go through now. So when now we look and we see all the things pulling at us, we can say, oh, this is old news. So, you know, a few thousand years ago, what they thought was cool and then is a little different than what's cool and now. But the concept is exactly the same. The concept hasn't changed. It's just the window dressing of it has changed. And this is what the Jews were contending with then, which means that the Jewish people's spiritual level was falling. It was falling. And we see this. I actually believe someone asked this as a question, maybe last week or the week before. But we see this. What was the sign to the sages? Wow, we are shifting. For the first time ever, after over 1,000 years from the giving of the Torah, we had an unresolved conflict among the sages. Meaning, nowadays, again, to us, that's normal. There's Sfardim and Ashkenazim, there's Hasidim, there's all different factions within Orthodoxy, and this one does it like this, and this one does it like this, and it's fine as long as you're following your rabbi. We think that's normal. That's abnormal. There's supposed to be one Torah, and all the Jews are doing the exact same thing. And it's a product of the exile state we're in, inner and outer, that we have different people doing different things. The first time it happened was about 1,000 years after the giving of the Torah, which means for 1,000 years it never happened. It doesn't mean the rabbis never disagreed. It means when they disagreed, they spoke it out. They came to a resolution, they voted, majority wins, and everyone accepted that was the ruling. Now, the first time it occurred, it was a very minor point, a point that would be completely irrelevant to any of our lives. It had to do with an offering of a sacrifice, so obviously it has nothing to do with us on a practical basis. But the sages were disputing, it's a very technical little detail. Even then they viewed it as a technical little detail. On a holiday, one of the things we do to a sacrifice is we literally put our hands on it and lean on it. It's called smicha, putting like a certain pressure on the animal, leaning on it. And the question was, if it's a holiday, are you allowed to do that? And the sages couldn't come to a consensus opinion. And the sages said, what a tragedy. What a tragedy that we don't agree. Once, because they understood our brains are small. What difference does it make? Lean on the animal, don't lean on the animal. Who cares? It only occurs on a holiday. It only is one little detail of a service on a holiday. What difference does it make? But the sages' sight was far farther than ours. And they understood that once you have this first point that we can't come to a consensus opinion on, there's going to be another one and another one and another one and another one and another one, and you get to what we have today. Again, not faulting anyone today. It's just the reality of our times, the reality of our situation. God needs to bring Mashiach. But this is where it began. But for 1,000 years, there was no such thing. For 1,000 years, Torah was so strong and it was so clear that there's no such concept that all the sages didn't, in the end, come to a consensus opinion. And here's where it began. As we see, the backdrop of this is what's happening to the Jewish people. It all works together. You can't say, well, the sages are in their ivory castle, their ivory tower, they're not affected. They're absolutely affected. There are sages. If the people are falling like this, the sages come to a point where they can't resolve this dispute among them. Again, it wasn't a negative confrontation. They just could not come to the consensus as the Jews were falling spiritually. And the majority of the Jews were becoming Hellenists. The majority of the Jews at this point were becoming Hellenists, Greek lovers, Greek adherents, wannabe Greeks. And now the sages can't reach a consensus opinion. It all works together. And again, this has tremendous resonating levels in our own lives, in our own culture of like, as in those places where the Jews want to be just like the non-Jews, and it just doesn't work. I mean, we've seen it. You can see it historically again and again and again. You go to Spain when the Jews said, okay, we'll convert to Catholicism. Then you'll love us. And the Spaniards hated those Jews the most. You go to Germany where you had the heart of the Jews tried what they called the Enlightenment. The Jews trying to be enlightened so much that they'd be just like the non-Jews. And the Germans said, really, you think you fool us? We know you're all dirty Jews under that window dressing. And we see this here. Again, this roots of this, the first time we really see this so clearly is with the misyavnim, with the wannabe Greeks, with the Greek lovers, with the Greek adherents, with the Hellenists. So again, looking at the political scene, we said after Alexander, we said we had the Babylonian Empire that morphed into the Persian Median Empire that was ultimately conquered by Alexander the Great, who's bringing in the Greek culture. This is the Greek Hellenist Empire. He envisioned one massive world empire controlled by him, fell apart with his death, and his generals cut up slices of his territory, and Israel fell under the Ptolemaic Egyptian kings. And that rule lasted for about 114 years. After 114 years, Israel was moved, again, not that we had any say in the matter, it's more what's happening between these powerful rulers as they're trying to conquer and control the world. So we got squished from the Ptolemaic rule to the Seleucid rule. Who are the Seleucid kings? The Seleucid are Syrian Greeks. The Ptolemaics were Egyptian Greeks. I'm just bringing this in, you know, a lot of times when we speak of the story of Hanukkah, we're approaching the story of Hanukkah. When we speak of the story of Hanukkah, it's the Greeks, it's the Greeks, it's the Greeks. Nobody there was literally from Greece. You know, the Septuagint wasn't made by someone from Greek. He was Egyptian. The Antiochus was not Greek. He was Syrian. But all of this is under Alexander the Great taking the Greek culture and making this a culture of the world. So after 114 years, we got switched in some bartering deal here from the Egyptian Ptolemaic kings, who generally did not harass us. They were pushing the Hellenist culture, but it was only done by cultural pressure. There was no aggression to it. We got switched to the Syrian Greek rule, the Seleucid kings. And of course, now things shifted very strongly. Now, in the beginning, with the early Seleucid kings, generally it was okay. Meaning, again, we had the same thing we had under the Ptolemaic kings, pushing Greek culture, a lot of more and more Jews becoming Greek adherents, but they're not doing anything more aggressive than that. There was one time when they tried to do something very aggressive. Now, again, you have to understand that these Jews that became Hellenists, unfortunately, many of them became anti the Jewish religion. In other words, they weren't like, maybe they were coming, maybe it was coming from a sense of guilt, and maybe they dealt with their guilt by being against, like we see nowadays as well, that sometimes if a Jew's going to feel guilty for not living as he knows God wants, so he's going to suppress that guilt and toward more aggression against Judaism. So unfortunately, a number of these Hellenists behaved in this fashion. And they were very aggressively trying to take whoever was the ruler at that time and get him against the traditional Jewry. So the Hellenists in one of these early Seleucid kings, so this was under Seleucid IV, and they said, oh, there's a tremendous treasure in the temple. You know, those old school Jews, when they're still sticking to that old religion that most of us have emancipated ourselves from. They have a lot of gold in that temple. I mean, it's a pity it's sitting in a temple. You know, the emperor should use it for the glorification of whatever we should glorify here, the stadiums or the amphitheaters or the coliseums of the gods. And he was like, great idea. So he sent a general, a trusted officer, general, Helidorus, to the temple with troops to seize the temple treasury. And when Helidorus entered the temple, he was marching towards that treasury, which they were told where it was by the Hellenists, by the Jewish Hellenists. And the priests, especially the high priests, were begging him and begging him and begging him, don't touch it. This is God's gold. This is God's jewels. This isn't for human consumption. And he ignored them. And then suddenly miraculously, a heavenly apparition of a rider appeared, like a form of a rider appeared and struck Heliodorus to the ground. Literally, physically, he suddenly fell to the ground as if he was struck by a rider, by this heavenly apparition. And when he recovered, he was so, wow, like he experienced this. He saw the truth of God's power, that he completely repented. He actually offered a sacrifice to God, a true sacrifice to the true God in reverence of God. And when he went back to Syria, he convinced this Seleucus, the Seleucus IV, don't start with them. Don't start with them. And he accepted that. And from that point on, the Assyrian Greek rulers left the committed Jews alone, meaning the campaign to Hellenize the Jews continued, but it was a peaceful campaign. There was no pressure, aggressive pressure to take, we'll use the term Orthodox Jew, just for simplicity's sake, to take a Jew who was committed to God and to rip him away violently from God. Because once, this happened once Seleucus IV tried and they saw what happened, they got scared and they backed off. And that was basically the situation until Antiochus comes to the throne. Antiochus, of course, is the Assyrian Greek leader that created for us the story of Hanukkah. He created one of the greatest downs for the Jewish people, and a down only exists for an incredible up. So as life was going and going and going, so to speak, if we want to philosophize for a moment, the drift of the Jews were to be Hellenists. And obviously give Hellenists a few generations and they stopped being Jews. So that was the drift. That was the current. So God stopped that current because he put Antiochus in power, and Antiochus was an incredibly violent, incredibly aggressive lover of Greek culture, which turned around the landscape of the Jewish world. Because through his violence, which forced such self-sacrifice from the few Jews that were remaining faithful to God, it actually woke up the hearts of their Hellenist brothers. And many, many, many of these Jews that had become Hellenists returned to God as a result of the aggression, the self-sacrifice, and the miracles that we call the story of Hanukkah. So when Hanukkah occurred, it did not occur at a time when the Jews were at a very spiritually high point. They were at an incredibly low point. They had never been at such a low point before, because the majority of the Jews were Hellenists. The majority of the Jews were Hellenists. The minority were still loyal to God. So God sent this very, very violent, aggressive Hellenist king to bring his children back home, which sometimes happens to us personally in our lives and happens, of course, in the world. It's what we call the concept of the descent is for the purpose of the ascent. We go down to go up. God gives us hard situations only out of love and only to grow and only to achieve our potential through them. So God here sent the Jews a very, very, very difficult, impossible situation. The story of Hanukkah is full of miracles. These Jews didn't deserve these miracles. It was the only way to survive would have been through these miracles. But this was the story that woke up the hearts of the Jews. In other words, everybody on this call, I don't know how many people are on this call now, but everybody on this call is someone who knows they're Jewish, their mother was a Jew, whose mother was a Jew, whose mother was a Jew, going all the way back to these Jews in the story of Hanukkah. These are the people we come from. If nature, so to speak, had played its course, the bulk of the Jews at that time wouldn't have any descendants today that know they're Jewish. Because the road they were going, it's how many generations does it take for them to lose their whole identity as Jews? We have Mashiach coming. It says one of the things Mashiach will do is he'll identify the Jews among the non-Jews. Can't even imagine. How many people are there out there in the world today that have no clue they're Jewish? But there's mother was a Jew. They're 100% a Jew and completely have no clue at all. So imagine all these Hellenists, these wannabe Greeks, if life had continued and there hadn't been the story of Hanukkah, a few generations later, their children wouldn't even know they were Jewish. We today, the descendants of them today, would have no clue. 2,000 plus years ago that they came from Jews, they'd have no clue whatsoever. So God didn't let that happen. You know, it's interesting, like you see this, and again, I'm saying you see this historically again and again and again. So when we had the movement of the Enlightenment, which was the Reform movement in Germany to make Judaism palatable to the Germans by taking away the Judaism from Judaism, the head of that whole movement, he said, I'm not trying to make the Jews non-Jews. He officially thought he was Orthodox. And 4 out of his 6 grandchildren baptized themselves. 4 out of 6, 2/3 baptized. Obviously, the other 2 weren't living a very Jewish life, but 4 of them baptized themselves. So when God doesn't send us these sometimes very strong messages, it just happens that the drift is, if we're going to assimilate, give it a few more generations, and the people don't even know they're Jewish at all. And of course, when Mashiach comes, we will have the unbelievable awakening of all these people that have no, I mean, how many times, I'm sure, I don't know if any of you have experienced this. I have personally experienced this. And I know so many people have personally experienced this. You're talking to someone and they have no clue they're Jewish. And you find out, wait, but your mother's Jewish, you're Jewish, or your mother's mother's Jewish, or your mother's 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 Jewish, or how many generations it goes back, the person still knows you're 100% Jewish. And it's like, wow. But imagine how many Jews are in the world whose mothers, to going all the way back 2,000 years is Jewish. And that's 100% of Jew today. And all these people will come back to God with Mashiach. That unbroken chain of Jewish mothers is 100% Jewish. All these people will come back with Mashiach. I've been talking straight as my tendency in this class when people don't ask any questions. Any questions, anything I said so far? Okay, so let's talk a little bit. We have a little bit more time to talk about Antiochus and the story of Hanukkah. So again, on one hand, I assume Hanukkah is something that most people here know better than they know almost any part of Jewish history. At the same time, you might not really know it at all. You just sort of know you light a menorah and spin a dreidel and eat latkes. But now we're looking at it from a historical perspective. So this, in 3586, is when Antiochus, who again, he was not Greek, but he was a Hellenist. He was the Assyrian leader that at this point is controlling Israel. Israel has been controlled now by this dynasty for about 25 years. So it's 25 years into this Assyrian dynasty. Antiochus saw it as his life mission to spread Greek culture and religion throughout his empire. He called himself Epiphanes, Antiochus Epiphanes, because in Greek, Epiphanes means the great. Behind his back, his subjects didn't call him Epiphanes, they called him Epimanes, because Epimanes means the crazy one, because everybody thought he was crazy, meaning his, I don't know if today if psychiatrists would say he was obsessive compulsive, I don't know exactly what designation they would give for him, but his obsession with Greek culture was an expression of his general insanity. And most of his subjects behind his back viewed him as insane, which didn't necessarily help us. But the Hellenist Jews, they were the adherents of Antiochus. They were the ones that called him not the insane, but the great. Not Epimanes, but Epiphanes. Because they said now, again, unfortunately, and again, we see this historically many times in our history, that the Jew that turns his back on Judaism is the Jew that's trying the hardest to destroy Judaism. It's almost like you have to suppress all the guilt, so you suppress it by turning it into this vengeance against Judaism. Unfortunately, that happened here, and unfortunately, this has happened many times in our history. So these Hellenist Jews said, now the time has come. I mean, we've tried, of course, But now we finally have on the throne an idiot, a madman, whose vision is that the Greek culture should take over the world. We got our man, because we want to destroy Judaism. And now we have the person who's going to do it. So the Hellenist Jews were the ones that were inciting Antiochus, who was crazy. And part of his craziness, part of his obsession was this vision of himself as world leader of Greek culture and religion to target Israel. Now, again, in a natural way, Israel would anyway have been targeted, because it was the only stronghold of resistance to Greek culture. But the Hellenist Jews made sure there was a lot of focus on it. And the first thing the Hellenist Jews did was to get Antiochus to take over the control of the position of the high priest. Now, we had already spoken, maybe last week, how the high priest position had become something that people bought, which we said was sort of an interesting desire, that these people desired to be the high priest, and they would pay for it, even though all these people that bought the rights to the high priest generally died within the year, because on Yom Kippur, when they went to the Holy of Holies, they never came out, they died. So it's sort of an interesting, like, they're not living a life for God, but they want this so much, and then they die because of it, and they don't even care. But still, even though the position of the high priest was bribable or purchasable, but it still basically stayed in the priestly family. So these extreme Hellenists wanted more. Now, what was happening then, I know this is a little bit, I'll take it, maybe it's a little bit of a complicated story, but just to show you what was going on. So originally meaning in this time we're talking about right now, there was actually a righteous Jew, a priest, from the priestly family, who was a high priest. His name was Chonia, which was short for Yochanan. So Yochanan was the high priest, and he was a very righteous, godly person. His brother, also obviously from the priestly family, was his brother, but he was a Hellenist. So obviously he didn't have a name like Yochanan. He called himself Jason. Jason is the Greek version of Yehoshua, Joshua. So we had two nice little Jewish boys, Yochanan and Yehoshua. And Yochanan became the high priest, and his brother, nice little Yehoshua, became Jason, the Hellenist. Jason bribed Antiochus with lots and lots of money to be put in his brother Chonia's place. So Antiochus said, sure. He's getting the money. He's getting a Hellenist in this tremendous position of authority in the Jews. It's good and it's good. It's better and it's better. It's only good. So now this position of the high priest, which had been actually held by a righteous person, which was unfortunately a bit unusual during that time, became held by a Hellenist, Jason, from the priestly family, but a complete Hellenist. Such a complete Hellenist that what did he do when he became the high priest? He built a gymnasium. He built a workout place close to the Temple Mount. So the priests and the Jewish youth, instead of going to the temple, should go to the hedonistic entertainments going on in the gymnasium. And obviously, as part of the entertainment, were always sacrifices to the gods. And that wasn't enough for the real hardcore Hellenists. It wasn't enough what Jason was doing, because Jason was still a priest. He was from the priestly family. He did qualify to be the high priest, except he was a Hellenist. Jason had we'll call him a friend, Menelaus, who probably wasn't even a priest. And Menelaus stole enormous sums from the temple, backed by all these extreme hardcore Hellenists, and he bribed Antiochus that he should be appointed the high priest instead of Jason. So Yochanan is a high priest, he's a righteous one. He gets kicked off by his brother, who's bribing Antiochus, who gets kicked off by his supposed friend, who probably wasn't even a priest, to become the high priest, to do even more horrific things. It says Menelaus took the vessels of the temple and used them to pay the bribe he gave to Antiochus to be appointed this high priest. And Chonia, going back to the original righteous high priest Yochanan, when he's twice deposed now, but he's still, the Jews knew he was the real McCoy. When he tried to stop Menelaus murdered him. So look, everybody here is Jewish. Chonia is Jewish. Jason's Jewish. Menelaus is Jewish. Look what's happening here among the Jews. And then the Sanhedrin sent a delegation to Antiochus complaining. I mean, Jason was bad enough. Look what Menelaus is doing. And Menelaus sent Antiochus a bigger bribe. And he had all those members of the Sanhedrin executed. So we see here what's happening as I'm saying, the Jews going their natural course, these Hellenists becoming more and more and more aggressively trying to rip apart whatever shreds were left of authentic Judaism. And that's the backdrop for the story of Hanukkah, to be continued next week. Thank you for joining. I hope we should have a wonderful week. And I hope what we're saying you see, as I see so clearly, the relevance and how we can see the parallel images in what we've experienced in our own times as well.